The matchup today is AMD's Ryzen 3 3100 versus Intel's i5-10400. We're going to be looking at some games today to see which one of these CPUs is a really good idea for you to spend your money on, and which one of these just maybe a little bit really just not worth your money. So let's look at those benchmarks. So before we get into the actual benchmarks, we do need to actually know what we're benchmarking against. First and foremost, we're starting with the Ryzen 3 3100. This is a 4-core and 8-threaded part. We're going to be pairing it together with 16 gigabytes of DDR4 memory. That's a 2x8 kit, and it's going to be running at 3200 megahertz because that is a really good sort of price to performance balance that you can get out of DDR4 memory. And frankly, this thing performed really nicely in my just sort of first look at an overclock on this thing with that type of memory. So 3200 megahertz, 2x8 gigabyte kit. Now, speaking of the overclock, we are running the 4.3 gigahertz overclock on this thing. This is with level 3 LLC as well as 1.3 volts on the CPU using the stock built-in Wraith Stealth cooler. So we're not really cheating there to get that overclock. That's with the stock cooler. So on the Intel side, we're featuring the i5-10400. This is 6 cores, 12 threads. It's going to be on a B460 motherboard, because I think that's probably the most fair way to evaluate this particular processor. If you're throwing a Z series motherboard in there, you are drastically raising the price of the platform. So I think it's most fair to put this with a B460 motherboard, but then there is the limitation that our RAM is going to be stuck on 2666 megahertz, which is probably where the Ryzen CPU, if it does get close to the 10400, that's going to be one of the big culprits here. Now, for the actual platform, beyond just the motherboard differences beyond the RAM, we're also running a GTX 1080 Ti. We're going to be running our games at 1080p to try to move a little bit of the gaming load over to the CPU to get a good feel for which of these CPUs is really going to be the way to go for people that are basically looking at a CPU anywhere from $100 like the Ryzen 3 3100 all the way up to $182, which is the general price that you're going to find the 10400 at. Though at this point, I ought to mention the Ryzen 3 3100 has been basically unavailable for a while now, so check the links down below for current availability in stock. The 10400, since it launched, it's actually had really good availability, so it's actually kind of likely that you won't be able to find the Ryzen 3 3100, but the 10400 may well be available, at least as of publishing, though again, links down below in case you want to check current pricing and availability. So all that housekeeping out of the way, let's take a look at these games that we're playing today and compare the results between these two CPUs. So as we get started with these benchmarks, we do have Fortnite on the low preset at 1080p, and what we see is the Ryzen 3100 losing to the 10400 by a little bit here, but still giving a great experience, and that's going to be a little bit of a trend as we look along in these benchmarks. So we see an average FPS for the 10400 of 283 versus 269 from the Ryzen 3100. Then the 1% low gives us another victory for the 10400 at 189 to 174, and the 0.1% low of 105 topping the Ryzen 3100's 95. Now, the percent time smooth comes from CapFrameX, and what we see here is both of these CPUs are actually getting very close to that 100% of time spent in the game being perfectly smooth. So this is an extremely good result for this title. Jumping over to the Metro Exodus benchmark on the normal preset at 1080p, once again we see a victory for the 10400, 127 to 111, and then the 1% low and 0.1% low once again follow that trend of the 10400 getting a narrow victory. Now, the percent time smooth is technically a victory for the Ryzen 3100 at 99.97% time smooth versus 99.95, but realistically that's well within what I would call the margin of error from run to run, and frankly both of those experiences are excellent. You are not going to notice any frame time jumping or dipping really with those percentages, so both of those are excellent results. Next up is Red Dead Redemption 2. The benchmark was set up using medium settings at 1080p. Once again, the 10400 gets a narrow victory. Both of those CPUs, however, are keeping that FPS above 60 the vast majority of the time. So that's really nice to see, though. With the 1% and 0.1% lows, we do see the 10400 keeping it a little bit closer to that 60 mark as those FPS numbers dip a little bit in tougher to run sections of the game. And then the percent time smooth was 100% on both of these CPUs. There was no stuttering whatsoever in this benchmark for either of these CPUs. So excellent results once again on the smoothness of the two CPUs, though once again the 10400 does get a victory here. Now, Borderlands 3 was one that I was very interested to see, mostly because in the past, we've seen quad-core processors struggle even with hyper-threading or SMT enabled. 4 cores and 8 threads has not always been able to save CPUs from a little bit of a stuttery mess with this particular benchmark. I did run it on the medium preset, and I did rerun my Ryzen 3100 overclock numbers because Borderlands, in the time between when I ran my last video and this video's testing, there was a pretty big update with Borderlands 3. So I did rerun these numbers for the Ryzen 3100, and what we found was the 10400 once again gets a victory, but this is an extremely close and narrow margin here, where the 10400 only had 113 FPS compared to the 109 from the Ryzen 3100, and the 1% and 0.1% lows were equally as close. And then when we look at percent time smooth, again, extremely narrow victory. This time for the Ryzen 3100, though yet again, I would definitely call this within that margin of error. But it's important to note with that percent time smooth, the Ryzen 3100, just keeping with the 10400 in my mind is enough, just because historically speaking, I've had quad cores struggle quite severely with this particular title, so the Ryzen 3100 gave an excellent performance in this particular benchmark. Now, when we average out the performance across all 4 games with these CPUs, what we see is the 10400 does give us a nice little bit of a boost in the average FPS, the 1% low and 0.1% lows. Though if I were showing you this particular set of numbers as representative of an actual game, I would say, you know, obviously get the 10400 if all costs are equal, but don't spend an arm and a leg extra to get a 10400 when the Ryzen 3100 is sitting on the table there. And the percent time smooth was a negligible difference there. So I wouldn't even really call that a win for either side, because I don't know that that's a repeatable difference. I would just say they're pretty much equal in that regard. Now, the place that the Ryzen 3100 does dominate the 10400 is on our price per frame chart here, where we see, if we're looking at the averages here, the Ryzen 3100 is a way better value than the 10400 per frame that you're getting out of that CPU, and that just continues along the 1% and 0.1% lows. The frames that you get out of a Ryzen 3100 at under $100 USD is just a fantastic value, especially when you're considering the price that you pay of about $182 for a 10400. Obviously, pricing is going to vary a little bit based on availability and that sort of thing, but you're paying a lot more money for a 10400 and not really getting a whole lot of performance back out of it. Now, it is absolutely fair to point out that with the 3100, you're going to want to spend a little bit more on RAM to get a higher speed memory kit than you would on a 10400, but when we talk about RAM costs right now, it's a very small difference between a 2666 megahertz kit and a 3200 megahertz kit. So you're not really spending a whole lot of extra on that RAM to get the Ryzen 3100 running a little bit faster. And I also want to point out, I have not completely tuned the Ryzen 3100 here. You could absolutely continue to tune the CPU a little bit more and probably squeeze just a little more performance out of it in some of these titles. And this was run with the stock Wraith Stealth cooler and the stock Wraith Stealth cooler's thermal paste that came with the CPU. So there's no aftermarket cooling going on with the 3100 to get it to that 4.3 gigahertz mark. So if you're just gaming, the 3100 is just a better value than the 10400. So with those results out of the way, the 10400 in gaming, if you're pairing it with a B460 motherboard, it's probably not actually the way to go, especially now that I was just looking today and the Ryzen 5 3600 is really undercutting the 10400 in price at this point. I think I saw it somewhere down in the 150 to low 160s range right now, which is well below the 182 mark of the 10400, and it's likely going to give you very good performance comparable to the 10400. Plus, of course, you can overclock the Ryzen 5 3600 out of the box and run fast memory with it out of the box. So really, the 10400 in just a pure gaming load, it's probably not the platform to go with. But the Ryzen processors do, at least in gaming, seem to present a really compelling value proposition, especially these Ryzen 3 processors. If you can get them for MSRP, then the Ryzen 3 3100 gives you really good gaming performance for a just $100 CPU. Of course, it's not completely fair to be comparing these two CPUs in the first place. Obviously, the Ryzen 3 3100 is much less expensive. It was probably always going to give us a better price per frame performance than the 10400, but I was curious just to see how much the 10400 would win in the raw benchmark data, and it wasn't as much as I thought it would be. Given this information, if I were building purely a gaming PC right now, I think I would actually go with a Ryzen 3 CPU if I was trying to save money, because with the money I save, I could actually get a better GPU or more storage or just better components in general. So that's a really good way to still get great gaming performance while still giving yourself the budget to get other good components in the system as well. But those are just my thoughts on this comparison. I am curious what you guys think, especially with the 10400, it is even worth it for gamers or really anybody, knowing that the Ryzen 5 3600 is the cost, or rather the price that it currently is, and for that matter, is the Ryzen 3 lineup a way to go for budget gamers, or do you feel that in the near future 4 cores and 8 threads is going to be too obsolete to recommend right now? Let me know all your thoughts in those comments down below. And of course, if you like this video, you want to see more like it, especially about the Ryzen 3 3100, give it a like, share, subscribe, comment, all those things. Very helpful for the channel. You can follow me both on Instagram and on Twitter at Hoosier Hardware, and as always, I'll let YouTube queue up a couple more videos from my channel for you to watch. I'm Shane with Hoosier Hardware, and I'll see you guys in the next video.